production the tremendous capacity built by these firms in the early 1930s. The first 5-year plan itself was not laid out by Gosplan. The Gosplan plan was just not workable. The final technical plan that was utilized was actually drawn up by a firm of industrial architects, Albert Kahn of Detroit. United Engineering, to give you a few examples, built a plant in the Soviet Union in the early 1930s to produce the longest aluminum sheets in the world, and these, of course, are essential for aircraft manufacture. This was the time when all-metal aircraft were just beginning, even in the West. General Electric built at Krakow a turbine plant which was 2.5 times greater in capacity than its own plant in New York at Schenectady. There were 3 gigantic tractor plants built in the Soviet Union, and the Soviets built more Internationals and more Caterpillars than those 2 companies built in the United States. Now, go back to my introduction, the 3 levels of information. The whole world largely still believes that the Soviets did it themselves. That's the official establishment version. In reality, the Soviets didn't do it. It was done by Western free enterprise. The cost in Russia were the millions of Russians who died in labor camps. I'd point out Solzhenitsyn's arguments, Julius Epstein, Operation Keelhaul. Did the American firms know about this? Yes, they did. They lied in their public announcements when they said there was no forced labor in the Soviet Union. And they knew they were lying. I know they were lying because I've seen the reports in the State Department files. The engineers on site in Russia were protesting. It was the time of the Depression. They had to have a job. And the firms told them to do nothing, say nothing, keep quiet. And I submit that our larger corporations, the corporate socialists, were no more interested in Russians dying in the early 1930s than they were in Americans dying in Korea and Vietnam with technology that they had installed in the Soviet Union. And yet the way this world is put together, it's the Harrimans and the Hammers and the Morgans and the Rockefellers who are admired and lauded. And those who plead for human decency and state the facts of dictatorship are slandered and insulted. And we find, regrettably, academics fall over themselves to perpetuate the myth. So back in the early 1930s, Gerard Swope of General Electric and Werner Baruch and their friends were building the 5-year plans in Russia, but they weren't inactive elsewhere in the world. And this is one period where I've been able to develop most of the story. Roosevelt's New Deal, the NRA, National Recovery Administration, was not drawn up by the Brain Trust or Roosevelt's advisors. It was drawn up by Gerard Swope of General Electric. And I've published the whole thing in the book I've just produced. I call it Swope's plan. It wasn't FDR's plan at all. And Herbert Hoover was quite correct when he called it fascism. Because Roosevelt's New Deal was nothing else but fascism along the lines of the Mussolini corporate state. And our friends, Werner Baruch and General Electric, building up the Soviet Union, were also very active financing and promoting and writing for Roosevelt in the early 1930s. But also, they were active behind Hitler. It's interesting that both Hitler and Roosevelt came to power in early 1933. Now, the story of the promotion of Hitler by our own corporate socialists is yet unpublished. But I'll tell you this much. It'll give you the flavor of the book. I have the bank transfer slips, which is about the hardest kind of evidence you can get, of funds going from large corporations to the Nazi Party, and particularly a political slush fund operated by Rudolf Hess. This was very important in the early 1930s when the Nazis needed all the money they could get to finance their gangs of goons going around the streets beating up people and the various payoffs and this kind of thing. One of these transfer slips refers to German General Electric, 60,000 Reichsmarks. And 2 directors of German General Electric will interest you, or should interest you. One is Gerard Swope, General Electric, and the other is Owen Young of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. So what we find is, when we begin to probe behind the scenes of history, is that we have these gentlemen promoting 3 brands of socialism all at the same time. They're building the first 5-year plan in the Soviet Union, they're writing Roosevelt's New Deal for him, and they're trying to get Hitler into power in Germany, all at the same time. So let's go back to the building of the Soviet Union. During World War II, you will remember, there was the massive Lend-Lease program. This pretty much replaced any capacity the Soviet Union might have lost in World War II, but more importantly, it brought the Soviet Union to a fundamentally new technological horizon. I've covered the whole story of this build-up in the Hoover series of books. By 1946, the Soviets had a capacity to do certain things themselves. They could manufacture the shells of factories, that is the building, which is not too difficult, and they could duplicate simple equipment, simple lathes, this kind of thing. But they still needed, and still need today, foreign technology to advance the technological horizon for a quite simple reason, that a socialist planned society cannot advance technologically by itself. And once again, Western businessmen were only too happy to oblige. And once again, they went into the Soviet Union in the 1950s, certainly the 1960s, and you'll see the peak of this in the last few years under Kissinger. And to give you again some examples from the development in these 20 years, you will find in mining equipment firms like Joy Manufacturing. Non-ferrous metals, you'll find they're using, for example, the International Nickel process for nickel smelting, refining. Iron and steel is an exception. The Soviets adopted the classical blast furnace back in the 1930s. Their plans were largely laid out by the Frame Corporation of Chicago. It's a very simple process. What they did was build bigger units, what I call scaling up. And in classical blast furnace technology, they have not come back to the West, but they have done, particularly in rolling techniques, and what you might call the high technology forms of steel and metals. In petroleum processes, you can see the copying of the Lend-Lease refineries all the way up to today. I think just a few weeks ago, there were recent agreements to transfer more petroleum technology to the Soviet Union. In chemicals, Arm & Hammer, Occidental Petroleum, of course, has always played a key role. Textiles, we find Soviet nylon, all their synthetic fabrics are Western fabrics, but of course with different model numbers, categories. Motor vehicles, all the motor vehicle plants I can identify in the Soviet Union have equipment from the West. They have been able to reproduce simple transfer lines, but as you know, with the Karma plant, still today, the Soviets require equipment mainly from the United States. Soviet atomic energy, their first reactor was a copy of the Hanford reactor, but more importantly, they couldn't have achieved their atomic energy program without United States help. I'm very skeptical today about the Rosenberg spy story. What is much more important is how did the Soviets get the industrial technology, the equipment, a very specialized kind of equipment, which is needed for an atomic energy program. This could only come from one of 3 countries, United States, Switzerland, or Great Britain. Locomotors, for example, we find General Electric is the standard. In aircraft, we find all the Rolls-Royce engines powered the MiGs over Korea. The door, for example, on some of the aircraft is a Boeing door. You go right down the line, it's there. Merchant Marine, I calculated that exactly because the Soviets have published a very exhaustive catalog, great big fat thing, of their Soviet ships. Every ship is there, cataloged with its technical specification, and I can tell you exactly 67% of the hulls were built in the West. 80% of the engines were built in the West. The 20% that were not built in the West were built in the Soviet Union, mainly at Bryansk and in Leningrad, under technical assistance agreements. There's no such thing as a Soviet marine diesel engine. That's what got the Soviet Weekly upset in London and said I was wild. And of course I pointed to their own catalogue, and it's right there if they bother to get a calculating machine, which of course will have to be Western, and they can repeat what I did. The computer technology is courtesy of IBM and Radio Corporation of America, but there's an English corporation, International Computers, which has transferred the most advanced of its own computer technology. I did happen to meet a director of this particular company last April when I was in England, and I pointed this out to him that it was his own suicide. He had more to lose than I